I don't think there are very clear answers to that. We've gone through this whole cycle of violence, and I'm not sure that we're anywhere close to being able to deter any future action like this.
On April 22nd, militants launched a brutal assault on a tourist site in Indian-controlled Kashmir, killing 26 civilians in what became the deadliest terrorist attack in India in nearly 15 years. What followed was the most intense military confrontation between India and Pakistan in decades. Airstrikes, drone attacks, and a terrifying cycle of escalation that threatened to spiral out of control. Then, suddenly, came a ceasefire on May 10th. In today's episode, I speak with Debak Das, assistant professor at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, to unpack the deeper roots of the Kashmir dispute and why it remains such a dangerous flashpoint between two nuclear-armed rivals. We explore how this crisis escalated so quickly and why it stopped just short of the brink. Debak Das also offers some sharp insight into the precariousness of the current ceasefire and what might come next. We recorded our episode live via Substack. If you'd like to join one of these live recordings, please just sign up for our Substack newsletter at globaldispatches.org. While you're there, you can also upgrade your subscription to access our full archive of content and every full episode of To Save Us from Hell, our podcast about the United Nations, as well as some of my own writing on the UN and other topics in international affairs. You'd also be supporting this show. Thank you. Now here is my conversation with Debak Das of the Josef Korbel School at the University of Denver. I wanted to spend the bulk of our conversation today talking about the implications of this recent, I'm calling it an almost war between India and Pakistan, but it was certainly the most intense conflict between these two nuclear powers in decades. This conflict, this latest iteration of the conflict, was sparked by all accounts a really horrific terrorist attack in India-controlled Kashmir in April 22nd this year. At least 26 people were killed. There's lots of social media videos of it. It really was, by all accounts, a really horrific attack. Before we get there, though, can I have you step back and introduce to listeners, explain to listeners a little bit about the conflict in Kashmir and why it's such a flashpoint between the two countries?
So let's dive right into the Kashmir conflict. And, the background to where we are at today really goes back all the way back to 1947. And 1947 is when India and Pakistan are partitioned. It's when both countries get independence. And of course, both sides want Kashmir. Kashmir at this point is led by a Maharaja Hari Singh, who is a Hindu king, but most of the population of Kashmir is Muslim. So Pakistan claims that, well, since they're Muslim, they should be a part of Pakistan. India asks Hari Singh to join India. Hari Singh wants to retain independence. 14th of August is when Pakistan gets independence. 15th of August is when India gets independence. And about a month later, as Kashmir is holding out, Pakistani irregular forces sort of invade Kashmir on the Western Front. At this point, Hari Singh reaches out to Jawaharlal Nehru, who's the Indian Prime Minister, says he wants to accede to India. India agrees, accepts the accession, and then Indian troops fly in, land in Srinagar, and where Indian troops and Pakistani troops kind of meet is what we today call the line of control. So that's the initial sort of start over this dispute. Now, Pakistan claims Kashmir is theirs. If you ask Kashmiris, would you like to be part of Pakistan? A majority of Kashmiris would say no. So there is a question of, does Kashmir have then a right to self determination, which some people have claimed that they should have? Is Kashmir a part of India? Legally speaking, it is. And then what then is the right of Pakistan here, right? And so this is the dispute in a nutshell. We've had wars in, of course, the initial war, which I mentioned in 1947 to 1948, that was the period. 1965, there's another war over Kashmir. 1971, there's an India-Pakistan war, but that war is over Bangladesh, so not over Kashmir per se. And 1999, you have a direct war in the Kargil area of Kashmir. So we've had these wars and, of course, frequent skirmishes, fighting taking place along the line of control, which, ceasefire violations are the normal. You would think that in a ceasefire, peace is the normal, but that's not the case. So what we have leading up to today, we've had frequent skirmishes at the state to state level. And then, of course, there have been a frequent number of terrorist attacks in Kashmir itself, and then in broader India as well.
Can you just explain, what do we know about what happened on April 22nd this year, and who was responsible for this attack?
What we do know about April 22nd is that there was a terrorist attack and 26 people died. Now, shortly after that terrorist attack, a group called the Resistance Front, which is a splinter group of the Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorist organization, it's been operating in Kashmir and in Pakistan since the late 80s. It really becomes popular in the 90s because of a number of terrorist events. And Lashkar-e-Taiba itself doesn't take credit. The Resistance Front takes credit.
Actually, that's a very generic terrorist name, the Resistance Front.
And for many people who even follow the conflict, many people were like, who are these people? So it's a generic name. What we do know is, 26 people died. It was a pretty horrific attack. Tourists were targeted in an area called Pahalgam in Kashmir, which is a very popular tourist spot. And, this is really the beginning of tourist season. So this is kind of the first batch of tourists who'd come in, and they were basically gunned down.
Yeah, I mean, I saw this it's a viral video at this point of this man just enjoying his time on a zip line. He's doing like a selfie video zip lining down this tourist spot where people below him are running for their lives, and he is oblivious to what's happening below him. And it just, I think, is a profound juxtaposition of like the joy that these tourists are expecting to experience and the horror that befalls them when this terrorist attack occurs, which I take it was really shocking to many, many Indians.
It was shocking because we haven't had a terrorist attack of this nature in a while. Probably the last terrorist attack that was at this scale that explicitly targeted civilians was the Mumbai attack of 2008. And so it's been a little while since civilians have been targeted in such an overt sort of manner.
So this attack, the Resistance Front claimed credit. I guess first, what do we know about the Resistance Front's ties to the Pakistani government itself? I know this is a long disputed issue, but what is like the best neutral evidence or not of whatever kind of linkages that this group may have had to the Pakistani military?
The Resistance Front itself, we know little about. What we do know is about the broader organization that it is a part of, which is the Lashkar-e-Taiba. Now, the LET, as it's sort of the short form of it is, the LET has had a long sort of history with the Pakistani military. So the evidence in terms of how can we link it, and your question is, in some ways, how do we know it was the Pakistani military, right? And I think the history here of LET with the Pakistani military being funded by the military, being trained by the military, having these training bases on the Pakistani side of the line of control in Kashmir, these things we know about and there's evidence of. That through the 90s and the early 2000s, that there was backing from the Pakistani state, there's evidence of. And in fact, very recently, and rather surprisingly, I would say, the Pakistani defense minister went on Sky News in an interview to the journalist Yalda Hakim and said, yes, we've funded them and we've been sponsoring them. It was a mistake. To his credit, he says it was a mistake, but the link is very clear and overt in that sense.
So, you have this terrorist group linked to the Pakistani military establishment carry out this horrific terrorist attack in Kashmir. What response did it generate within both the Indian public and the Indian elite decision-making circles?
The Indian response within the public, of course, it was, as we've been noting, it was a horrific attack, first time in more than a decade that there is an attack like this. And what's also interesting is the tourists were from different parts of India, right? So it wasn't just Kashmir that was affected. It was people from Bengal, people from South India. So in that sense, it was in many ways a nationwide tragedy. There was absolute horror and anger, obviously, at the fact that, we're in some ways back here, right? This idea of a regular event of terrorism that takes place in Kashmir was, a 90s and early 2000s thing. And we really didn't want this to be back, but it is. For the Indian government, I'd say, this, for the Modi government, especially, this is the first kind of challenge where civilians have been targeted. In the past, in 2016, 17, we've had attacks on Indian paramilitary forces. There was a major attack in 2019, and those in a place called Pulwama. And those were attacks on at least folks that you could discriminate and say, look, these folks are some way related to the military. So this created a challenge for the Indian government because it wants to try and deter these sort of attacks from taking place. At the same time, it wants the Pakistani military to stop maybe backing some of these groups. And at the same time, I do believe that the Indian government is not interested in a long term protracted war. So, how do you then calibrate a message or a response which is going to do some of these things for you and prevent future attacks, right? So, I think that that was a difficult spot for the Indian government.
So ultimately, what did the military response by India look like?
So I should say before the military response, there were a few other responses which were on the diplomatic side. Initially, India put the Indus Water Treaty in abeyance, which is something that hasn't happened before us, I want to say 50 years, maybe 60 years of the Indus Water Treaty existing, because water sources are flow through India and then into Pakistan. And there's a water sharing agreement. And India said, you know what, we're putting this in abeyance. We will potentially use water as a tool of coercion. So one, and that was within 2 to 3 days of the initial attack taking place. The military response, as you mentioned, came about 2 weeks later. The military response was on the night of May 6th, early May 7th, and India basically targeted 7 terrorist holdouts, if you will. The idea there was that India would conduct these standoff strikes against these 9 sort of targets, which were not only on the Pakistani side of the line of control in Kashmir, but also in Punjab, right? Like territory that is not disputed and Pakistani heartland. And that, in some senses, is something that hasn't happened before. I think the Indian government's signal here was that, hey, we are serious, we are willing to strike places like Bahawalpur in Punjab, which are known to be sort of hotbeds of the Jaish-e-Mohammed, right? Which is another terrorist group, not necessarily linked to this attack, but linked to a broader sort of architecture of individuals working together on sort of creating some form of unrest in Kashmir. So were hit on the night of the 6th, early 7th. That was the main initial Indian military response.
And then what was Pakistan's response? How did they respond to being attacked, as you noted, not just on the over the line of control in Kashmir, but in the Pakistani heartland, which had not happened before to this scale?
The Pakistani response was interesting because the Indian foreign minister later on has come out and said that, look, we told Pakistan that there was going to be an attack and that we would target certain infrastructure, which we believe is terrorist infrastructure. And so, in that sense, India gave Pakistan a warning and a heads up that this sort of attack was going to take place. Now, in some ways, for India, this was also giving the Pakistani military an off ramp, saying, look, you can clean your hands off this, say terrorist infrastructure was targeted, and we don't consider this to be an attack on the state. Wash your hands off this. And that's the off ramp, right? This could have been a one off. The Pakistani military did not see that as necessarily an off ramp. The Pakistani military had basically, after the strikes on the 9 targets, there was an prolonged air battle that took place on the same night between the two air forces. According to some reports, it was potentially the biggest air battle that we've seen since the Second World War, with 60 odd jets on each side, give or take. So, about more than 100 jets in the air. There's the kind of stuff that you haven't seen in the last 50 years, the last 70 years, right? The other response that we saw from Pakistan was that their shelling across the line of control in Kashmir increased. And then there were, within the next couple of days, by the 9th of May, rockets that were being fired from the Pakistani side on Indian military targets, but also these drone swarms, which is fairly new, which sort of appeared along civilian populations and cities in India along the border. And this is along the national border, not the line of.
Yeah. So these drone swarms, which are just like typically hundreds of drones operating in concert, attacking in coordination at specific targets. This is like a new iteration of combat. And they were attacking civilian infrastructure in India.
So they were attacking airports. They were attacking some civilian infrastructure. Our understanding from at least the Pakistani sources and their press conferences is that they were also trying to not just attack airfields, but air defenses of
Mm. Yep.
Indian 400 air defense systems, for example. There was some talk, and this remains to be confirmed. Pakistan claimed to attack a BrahMos, which is a cruise missile that India and Russia have jointly developed, that they attacked a BrahMos cruise missile sort of depot. The idea there is essentially trying to take out some form of Indian military infrastructure as create the threat of use of force against the civilian population.
Yeah. And it's clearly at this point that we seem to be locked in this escalatory cycle, to which India responded with even more attacks, this time kind of deeper into the Pakistani heartland, targeting cities as well.
In terms of cities, there were airfields that were targeted. So for India, what's interesting is the first night, it did not target Pakistani military installations or any military equipment, apart from the air battle. In terms of the ground targeting, there wasn't any military targets there. As this conflict then continued, India then opened up the targeting of Pakistani military installations. So India too sent in drone swarms. India too started doing these rocket attacks on Pakistani airfields, some of which were near Rawalpindi, some of which were close to Islamabad, Lahore. And the idea there is that we basically fell into the tit for tat sort of escalation. So it was okay, if you've sent like a drone swarm next to two of my cities, I too can send a drone swarm next to cities. If you think that you can attack my infrastructure, I too can attack your infrastructure. Sort of a very simple, in some sense, if you've read Thomas Schelling, it's a very classic sort of escalatory dynamic. Of course, the trouble with that escalatory dynamic is that there isn't necessarily a clean stopping point. You attack 5, I attack 6,
Yeah.
and then so on.
So eventually, though, this escalatory cycle was broken. And, honestly, I personally was surprised with the speed in which the ceasefire was apparently agreed in the midst of this really kind of dangerous escalatory cycle, as you described. What do we know about how that ceasefire was achieved?
Of course, we had the United States come in towards the end of the conflict when the ceasefire was announced. But we had intermediaries from, believe it or not, Saudi Arabia and Iran doing shuttle diplomacy between India and Pakistan even before the US got involved. When the US initially was asked about India Pakistan, people like both Vance and Rubio said, this is their business. Like, we don't want to get involved. Now, something happened on the night of the 8th and early ninth. CNN reported that the United States received strategic intel, which alarmed the White House, which then set everything into motion from at least the United States' point of view. What that was is extremely unclear. What we do know is the morning of the 9th, Reuters reported that Pakistan had called a meeting of their National Command Authority, the NCA, which overlooks its entire nuclear establishment
Yes.
and forces.
That will catch your attention.
Anybody's attention, right?
Yes.
And a couple of hours later, the Pakistani defense minister comes and talks to a local media news outlet and says, no such meeting has been called. Reuters stands by its reporting and says, well, the military sources had confirmed this meeting was taking place, and then later on it was sort of withdrawn. In my book, as I read it, that's enough of a signal, right? If you want a third party to get involved, if you want the United States to get involved, that's enough of a signal to try and catalyze that sort of superpower behavior. And it looks like that sort of strategy worked. From the Indian side, there was also willingness to have a ceasefire because, in some ways, in that cycle of exchanges, both sides were starting to deplete their stores. So there are only so many air defense missiles that you can load on and use before you sort of replenish your stock. So there's a counterfactual question here of how long could this have gone on if it didn't actually stop on the night? We don't know. Would have become more difficult, and you would have had to go to other forms of military equipment other than the rockets and the aircraft that were being used.
So we are now about 10 days or so into this ceasefire. I forgot the date today, but about 10 days or so, give or take. I mean, it's holding as far as I can tell, but is there a prevailing sentiment both among the Pakistani national security establishment and the Indian national security establishment that this ceasefire is sustainable?
I'm not sure that there is a sense that this ceasefire is sustainable. What's interesting about this particular ceasefire is that, yes, as soon as they agreed the ceasefire, within 4 hours, there was another drone swarm that came into India from the Pakistani side. Those were shot down. The line of control, though, continues to be hot in the sense that there is a ceasefire to the larger hostilities that we saw. But in terms of firing across the line of control, that is continuing to take place. So it's an uneasy piece, if you will. And, will this escalate back to where it was at the beginning of the month? I'm not sure that it would escalate from where we are right now in terms of just ceasefire violations. You might need a bigger sort of attack of some form to catalyze a bigger response for things to get escalatory. But I think it is worrying that, we still have active military engagement on both sides taking place right now.
I wonder from like an Indian perspective, how much this conflict, as evidenced by this latest episode, is just like a drag on India. India is presenting itself as this great emerging geopolitical power, yet they are sucked into what to the outside world seems to be like a petty territorial dispute with a neighbor that, while nuclear armed, is substantially weaker and smaller than India. And if there is any, therefore, incentive for India to want to find creative ways to move past this beyond simply that military escalatory cycle that we've seen.
Absolutely. I think this comes at a bad time for India and Indian foreign policy objectives. In that sense, it is a drag. You're right. India would have liked not to talk about Kashmir in international forums again. It would not Kashmir to be the focal point of its foreign policy. And it has worked really hard over the last decade to do something we call dehyphenation. Dehyphenation being that India and Pakistan are often talked about in a sort of hyphenated sense. And India
Yeah.
wants talked about without Pakistan in the picture. That dehyphenation policy is in some ways, at least momentarily, out the window because we are all talking about India and Pakistan. So, in that sense, there's been a rehyphenation. And for Indian foreign policy, that's being thrown off the track that it wants to project as being its foreign policy goals, right? As you said, emerging power, wants to be an emerging economic power, emerging regional power, wants to be a bulwark against China, uphold democratic ethos, and all of those things. And, once you get embroiled in military action over a territorial dispute, all of those things kind of fall by the wayside.
What's next, do you suspect, in over the next, say, weeks or months, or actually, frankly, even days, considering how fresh this conflict is? Are there any key moments or inflection points that you will be looking towards that will suggest to you how this situation may unfold?
So I think there are a few things to think about over here. And one is, of course, what is the role of the United States? There's already been talk of, what were the kind of tariff related incentives that either India or Pakistan were given. Pakistan was given an IMF loan of $1 billion. So there's a question of how does this conflict sort of fit into the other broader sort of bilateral and multilateral meetings that we have coming up in the run up to when the UN sort of meets at the end of summer. And I think in terms of in the next few days, what I would be looking at is, well, first of all, clearing the air of disinformation is the first thing that I'm looking forward to. Because over the course of these 4 to 5 days, there was a lot of disinformation coming out from both sides. Both medias claimed a whole bunch of things which weren't true. It became incumbent on the governments to then come out and say, well, maybe this is true. And no, we definitely didn't do that. The Indian social media, for example, started claiming that India had hit a place called Kirana Hills, where Pakistan is meant to store its nuclear weapons, that there was some sort of radiation leak. And of course, the Indian military, in fact, in a press conference said, no, we didn't do that. And the Pakistanis also said, no, we didn't do that. And in fact, the IAEA came in and said, no, there's no radiation leak that we know of. So there was a lot of disinformation. So we're still trying to find out more about, what were the kinds of systems that were used. And in the slightly longer term, I think the question is this going to deter the terrorist action that sparked off this cycle of violence to begin with? And I'm not sure about that. Seems to me that from the Pakistani side, Pakistan, of course, claimed victory. And, the military got involved pretty fast, which signals to us that, some of the pressure that the United States has been also putting on Pakistan as it becomes closer to India on sort of asking the military to wash its hands off these terrorist organizations. During the conflict taking place, there was a couple of funerals that we actually saw where the Pakistani military was there standing with persons of interest to both the United States and India.
Hmm.
So it was also a clear signal that, no, we're not washing our hands off these entities that operate on our soil. So if that continues, then I think, it's inevitable that you're going to have an incident like the Pahalgam incident, maybe worse again. And at that point, the question for India would be, are you going to go in and strike Pakistan again? The noise that's come out of India in the aftermath of this event is that there is a new Indian doctrine. And the new Indian doctrine is that India does not distinguish between terrorist attacks and conventional military action against India. It thinks of both as the same. Now, that's a slippery slope, right? Because that means that any rogue actor anywhere along the line of control could potentially spark off a war
Yeah.
between India.
Yeah. Like you can imagine like a hot-headed terrorist or terrorist group just, whose incentive is to start a war between the two countries, view that doctrine as an invitation to achieve their longstanding objective. Wow.
The worry, right?
Yeah.
how do you not tie your hands into a doctrine that you then have to follow through? And how can you potentially deter terrorist action? I don't think there are very clear answers to that. We've gone through this whole cycle of violence, and I'm not sure that we're anywhere close to being able to deter any future action like this.
Debak, we will have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. This was really helpful.
Thank you for having me, and sorry to end on a slightly depressing note there.
Well, we'll have to have you back when peace is declared. To the live stream viewers, thank you for joining. I will be publishing the full conversation behind a paywall later today. So if you came in halfway through, please get a subscription to Global Dispatches. Help me do what I do, bring amazing guests like Debak on the show, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.